All right, the last section in Chapter 4 is going to be Chapter 4.5, which looks at the helminths. These are the parasitic worms. And your last objective covers that section, looking at or wanting you to know or be able to list the main groups of helminths and then the two subgroups of one of these groups, that'll make plenty of sense in just a minute. So, the helminths include tapeworms, flukes, and roundworms. Again, parasitic species. Now, this is a group of organisms that is included in microbiology, so you would think they are small. And in fact, they have part of their life cycle that is very small, but sometimes the adult species can be large enough to be seen with the naked eye. And in some cases are actually quite huge relative to them being found within the field of microbiology. So not all flatworms and roundworms are parasites, very similar to the protozoans. Some of these guys, or a lot of these guys, live in the environment, soil, water, and they don't cause any problems to anyone and are actually probably helpful in the environment to the overall circle of life in some way. However, if they get into the human body and they cause problems, they're going to be considered parasitic. And these parasitic worms will always spend at least part of their lives within the GI tract. So, if there were to be a question on the exam, where do all helminths spend at least some time of their life within the human? That's going to be within the intestinal tract. And sometimes that is the only place they live. But occasionally, some of these organisms can get out of the intestinal tract and move to other areas of the body. All right, so the two main groups are the flatworms and the roundworms. Within the flatworm category, all right, the phylum Platyhelminths, platy is going to be flat, are the trematodes and the cestodes. All right, the cestodes are tapeworms, and the trematodes are your flukes. Both of these are going to have a flat, thin body plan, and it's generally going to be segmented. Then the roundworms are also called nematodes, and this is from a different phylum, and they have long, cylindrical, and generally unsegmented body plans. So here's some examples of the flatworms. So you have the cestoid or the tapeworm here, and you can see all of the different segments. And this is a real photograph of one organism, presumably pulled from somebody's body and washed very well, so it looks all nice and pretty. But you notice here the length, all right, 1 centimeter. And how long is that? That is quite long. All right, that is macroscopic. You can see it. It is, who knows, a foot to 2 feet long? All right, long. And then here you have the flukes, or the trematodes. All right, flat-like body. They're going to be, I don't know what you would call this shape, fluke-like. All right, but there's going to be an end where it gets thinner, and that's going to be basically its head, where you would see the oral sucker, and the head of the cestoid, at least, is going to be called the scolex. And you have all of the parasitic worms are going to have at least 1 oral sucker and possibly even 4. All right, then here is a picture of a nematode, and these are going to be the roundworms, and they're round. All right, in terms of their cross-section, it would be a pretty good circle, or maybe oval in some places, and that is the roundworm. All right, so what you want to be able to differentiate is nematode and cestode, trematode. What are those? Is that a roundworm, a fluke, flatworm? All right, so there might be some matching there. All right, then the life cycle of these organisms. We're just going to look at One example, that is the pinworm, and this is Enterobius vermicularis, and this is a roundworm, and it's called pinworm, sometimes a seatworm, because you find it on your seat. That would be your bottom. So the major issue is going to be the development of enterobiasis. All right, entero being intestinal tract, and biasis is going to be indicating inflammation, more or less. And so the pinworm itself is, the adult pinworm can range from 2 to 12 centimeters, and it's going to have that cylindrical shape. And this is figure 4.17, pretty self-explanatory in terms of, if you start here with this little girl, all right, in her intestinal tract, you have both male and female pinworms, all right, roundworms. And they're going to be within the intestinal tract, and within the intestinal tract, they're going to mate. So they undergo sexual reproduction, and within the female, there are eggs. The eggs get fertilized, and then for whatever reason, whether it's temperature, environment, the female is going to move to the anus to lay the eggs. And this is typically going to occur at night because you think about a child, and it's generally children who get infected. They don't sit around still for very long. And when they're asleep, their body is still, and that helps to persuade the female worm with fertilized eggs to move out to the anus and then to lay her eggs. All right, that process in itself can cause itching and irritation. The fact that the eggs are at the anus and they emerge from the anus, again, also itchiness and irritation, and so the child is simply going to scratch. All right, children do not always have the best personal hygiene practices, and so if they've got an itch, they're often going to scratch it and not necessarily be concerned about what might be on their fingers or under their fingernails after the fact. And so the eggs get onto the fingers, the fingertips, the fingernails, and they can be self-infection, self-inoculation if that child puts his or her fingers back into her mouth or into her mouth. Or this child is then playing with this child and touching a toy, passing the toy on. This child gets the eggs on his fingers, inadvertently puts his fingers into his mouth, or if they're younger, maybe puts the toy into his mouth, and then there's a new infection. Eggs are transferred to a new host, and now this child is going to come down with that. So, how is this caught? Well, the child is often irritated in terms of, or irritating, grumpy. They may be extra tired because if this process is occurring while they're asleep, they may not be sleeping as well as they could, so they wake up tired. And again, we're talking 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds that can be, their moods can be affected by even half an hour less of sleep, or maybe their naps are interrupted. And so they can be irritated. There's generally not a whole lot of distress within the intestinal tract, but it's not good to have this because they can get large, and if they are large enough, they can actually start to consume the food within the intestinal tract before the host's intestinal tract or intestinal cells are able to absorb the material. And so if this is long-term major infection, it can actually lead to malnourishment, which is probably what you see in third world countries, where this is going to be a pretty major issue, and food is sometimes hard to come by naturally. And so then if they have a parasitic infection that is competing for their food, they can become even more malnourished. How this is diagnosed is sometimes especially if the child is still in diapers. There can be, you might see the eggs in the morning. If the female worm gets caught outside of the body, it may not have time to move back in, and so a parent or caregiver might actually see the worm. Sometimes if a pinworm infection is suspected, you can actually put a piece of Scotch tape across the anus at night and just allow the child to sleep with that piece of tape, and do your best to not have it be an irritation to the skin. And then when the female egg or the female worm comes out to lay her eggs, the Scotch tape will actually be sticky enough to catch those. And you simply bring that piece of tape to the doctor's office. He or she looks at it and says, yes, this is the infection, and the treatment is pretty easy. So that is the parasitic helminth group.